Yeah, so my name's Sarah, and my background's a little bit unusual because many, many years ago, I ran away to sea at the age of 17 and
Wow.
ended up as a deck officer working on tankers. Had an absolutely fabulous time at sea this is sort of 70s and 80s. And
Wow.
then when I came ashore eventually, thought, well, what do I do now? And ended up becoming an academic. So I now teach on the maritime business program that we have in the business school at Plymouth. Um, and so this maritime business is part of global logistics. And
Hmm.
this talk obviously was around the global logistics theme. And then as I was starting to put the talk together, I was thinking, yeah, but actually this links in with this and this links in with this. And then when I'm doing researching and working with colleagues, I'm working across faculties, across disciplines in so many different ways. And that's actually one of the key themes of the way I'm presenting the talk. It's showing linkages across lots and lots of different disciplines. So I hope you find it interesting. And hi, Evie. Welcome to my talk. So it's great to have you join us. And I'm Sarah Tuck, and I'm just about to start. I shall share my screen and start on a presentation here with PowerPoint, our old friend, PowerPoint, otherwise known as death by bullet points. But I just thought, oh, what do we do? It's a lovely sunny day out there. Let's just have lots of nice pictures. So it's more pictures than bullet points. So global logistics and the highways of the sea. As I say, my background is in the Merchant Navy. So I'm actually qualified as captain of ships, although it's a long, long time since I was at sea. So, oh, I've gone too far. So the sea. The first question I thought about is, well, who owns the sea? And if you're trying to answer that question, because we use the sea for our global logistics, but also obviously the sea is really important from the environmental point of view. From the point of view of global warming, it's been a sink for a lot of our excess carbon dioxide that we've been producing. So who owns it? And if you want to answer that one, you then have to go and study international law, because there is in fact a framework that's been provided by the United Nations, and it's based on a series of international conventions going right back to the end of the First World War, and then a history well before that of people arguing about who owns the sea. What we have today is this United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea 1982, put together by the United Nations, and that then sets the whole regulatory framework for everything from the fact that ships have to have a flag, which is their kind of the national flag they have to be registered with, to this business of actually who owns it and how do we divide up ownership of something like the sea. So the formula they've used to come up with in this convention is to divide the sea into basically three main zones. So we have our territorial waters, which originally was 3 miles out from the shore, because basically that was about as far as you could fire a cannon. So if you could fire a cannon 3 miles out to sea, you could control the ships 3 miles out to sea. But in the modern age, A, we don't have cannons, and B, countries want to have that really full legal control over further than 3 miles. So today it's a 12-mile limit out to sea is the territorial waters. So that is actually part of a country's territory over which they have complete control. And then beyond that, we have what they call the exclusive economic zones. And that's the area where the countries are able to control and to exploit all the resources of the seabed and the sea, like the fish. And then beyond that, they use the expression the area, which I find a bit strange. But the area is basically what we think of as the high seas. So the area doesn't actually belong to anybody. But if you're looking at this business of the EZ, this exclusive economic zone. This then took me to a research project that I'm working on with a PhD student, Hoda, and she's given me permission to show you some of her work. So what she's researching is the Eastern Mediterranean, where there's been some massive recent finds of natural gas in what they call the Levantine Basin, which has a lovely old-fashioned ring to it. And because they've discovered this gas, then countries are starting to go, yeah, but I want, that's my seabed, that's my seabed. And the way it's divided up is we have this framework already provided by the convention, the 82 convention, and out it goes to up to 200 miles. But what happens when you bump into another country? Well, you kind of split the difference between the two. And if you can't agree, there's then a framework for arbitration where you can sort out who owns what. So what we have here, as you can see, is Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Lebanon and Israel are in dispute over a bit of that, which way exactly the boundaries go between their EEZ. We then have Cyprus, and of course Cyprus is split between the Turkish Republic in the north and then the Greek part of Cyprus in the south. And Turkey then has claimed an extended EEZ, but then the Greek part of Cyprus has also laid their claims to their EEZ. So they've more or less come to an agreement over who has what. But it is still a source of tension. And, Turkey and Greece, Lebanon and Israel and Syria, Egypt as well, they're all involved here. So basically, is this going to be the spark for maybe, more war, more trouble? Or actually, because they have to get together, they have to work on who's controlling which bits of the seabed so they can then give licenses so that the gas can be extracted. So maybe they can use this as a way of building bridges to peace. So this is what Hoda's looking at. And she's not studying anything to do with maritime logistics or anything like that. She's actually situated in the politics and international relations area, but I'm helping and assisting in this because of my background in maritime and understanding about the maritime and the maritime law and the law of the sea. She's not the only person who's studying this kind of problem. So I've actually got some of my students who've been looking at the South China Sea, where China is projecting its power and claiming small islands. And of course, you can put a 200-mile ring around a small island. You've got a lot of seabed there. And in arguments with various neighbors as to who owns what, because there's oil to be found around there as well as gas. So that's sort of one way of looking at who owns the sea. But then we look at the area known as the area, this high seas, and the United Nations basically says, well, nobody owns that and nobody controls it, but there are some aspects of what goes on the high seas that are controlled in international law, and the main ones are piracy, slavery, and then the threats of pollution, where the pollution might be washing up onto the shores or into the territorial seas of the country. So there's a convention known as the Intervention Convention that allows a country to intervene against other ships of other nations that are threatening to pollute their shores. And also international law allows you to deal with piracy at sea. And because piracy has got a fantastic swashbuckling, Pirates of the Caribbean image, but has anybody seen Captain Phillips?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have. Great film, isn't it? And that really, that shows kind of the face of modern piracy. There's an even better film actually being made about one of the early ships that was pirated off Somalia. It was a Danish ship, and that's based again on a true story of the negotiations around how they got the crew released.
You'll have to give it a watch.
yeah, I'll it's in Danish with subtitles, but it is well worth watching. So, you know, piracy still a problem, and it's not just off Somalia, where actually international cooperation has had a big impact on dealing with that, but also West Africa. There's big problems there with piracy. So it's a favorite area for my students to research, and there's different ways of looking at it. So you can go from the point of view of the ship owner, and that's a maritime area. You can look at it from security, because there was a security talk earlier on, and there's been a lot of argument about whether there should be armed guards being put on board ships, and whether it's more effective to have guards armed or actually unarmed guards, but who are trained obviously to deal with threat situations. And in fact, in the really difficult areas, they have had a lot of success putting guards on board ships. It's very difficult putting guns on, though, because, again, there's international laws about the movement of guns around the world. So then you look at it from the international law approach, and the international law around security, around what happens when we capture pirates, you know, which country do we try them in, and under what laws, and actually how do we define piracy as well. So that's some really fascinating research there. Okay, so that's sort of looking at it from the law point of view, and also international relations. But then we're talking about the sea and the you know, the highways of the sea I've talked about in my title, and that then brought me to the idea, and this idea of ownership and who owns the sea. If nobody owns the sea, it's similar to common land, which especially in England in the 19th century, there was quite a lot of land that nobody actually owned, but everybody could put their cattle and their goats and their pigs on to graze it. And an economist came up with the idea of, he called it, was known as the tragedy of the commons, which basically says that if there's a resource that no individual owns, it's owned in common by society, then as a rational individual, if this is a piece of common land, I'm putting my cows on it, I'll put them on to graze. And if I put on extra cows to graze, I get all of the money from selling those cows or getting their milk. And yeah, eventually it's going to be overgrazed, the common, but the cost of that overgrazing is sort of spread amongst all the users of the common, whereas the gains of having extra cows is my gain alone. So rationally, I'm just going to keep putting more and more cows onto that common until it's grazed, completely overgrazed, and the whole thing collapses. And the other way of doing that is thinking about pollution. If the ocean belongs to nobody, I can pump more and more pollution into it. It's saving me huge amounts of money. I don't have the costs of disposing of my raw sewage or my rubbish. I can just shove it all into the ocean. And that's great because it costs me nothing. But of course, what happens then is that eventually the resource collapses. So we end up with heavily polluted oceans. So that's an economics way of thinking. And that, you know, brought me to going, well, economics is a really important tool for looking at the way we use our oceans and the resources that we're trying to share and how we share them out. And of course, you can study economics at the Plymouth Business School and research that kind of problem. And that is the tragedy of the commons, basically. Doesn't that look sad? All that rubbish, there's old fishing nets, there's plastic bottles, there's a pallet there. If the oceans belong to nobody, everybody's just going to trash them. There has to be a better way of doing it. So how do we deal with this? So one of the big problems actually with the oceans is fish. Fish is a resource. And in the 19th century, there used to be massive shoals of cod off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. and they were fished by Americans, they were fished by the British, they were fished by everybody, basically, that could get a fishing boat out there. And eventually, in the last century, they completely overfished the stock, and the cod stocks just collapsed, and there was no fish left for anybody. So how do we share out these resources without having this tragedy of the commons? Well, there's technical ways of dealing with it. So you can try and clean up. Technically, you can use skimmers and scoopers to skim and scoop up rubbish and oil from the water. You can maybe breed more fish stocks. You can, for carbon dioxide, maybe we can capture carbon dioxide and stop it from causing greenhouse gas effects. Another way of looking at it is, well, if the problem is selfish individuals who are putting their individual benefit before the common good, let's just tell everybody, well, look, you've got to behave well. So, we're told that we need to be cut down on our car use. We need to eat less red meat. We need to do this. We need to do that. We need to save on electricity. And that's fine. But if you decide, oh, I'm not going to go on a foreign holiday, I'm not going to fly because that's bad for the planet. And then you watch your neighbours flying off for the sunny holidays. And you think, hang on a moment, why am I giving up when they're not? And we see it with countries. People say, well, why should the UK cut back on its carbon dioxide usage? Well, look at China, look at India. Yeah.
Isn't there sometimes a debate around, sort of in that analogy, when your neighbour is shooting off on the flight, you're on an equal footing, but in some of these sort of less economically developed countries, they are exploiting these resources that we were exploiting hundreds of years ago. So there must be a difficult line to draw between having the privilege to turn around and say, look, these are the mistakes that we've learned from, but also we've had the economic growth from exploiting it for hundreds of years. So how do you subsidize them if we want to preserve these ocean resources?
Yeah, and that is a really good argument as well. And in fact, in the Kyoto agreements around greenhouse gas emissions, one of the key elements of that was that the less developed countries were given very, very generous carbon budgets, and it was on the developed world that the onus was put to cut down on our carbon use, because, as you say, we've had the economic advantage of that. In shipping is going on to carbon use. There's a lot of debate now about the carbon dioxide that shipping's emitting. I don't know if you picked up on any of it. There's some good documentaries available on that area, and in shipping, they tried to impose the Kyoto Agreement idea of less developed countries need to have a bit more generous budgets than developed countries, and the shipping regulator, which is the International Maritime Organization, is part of the UN. They said, no, it doesn't work with shipping. We can't do that. In shipping, we have a rule that says no more favorable treatment, because if you tax all the ships that are flying UK flags and French flags and German flags and US flags, if you tax them much more than you tax ships that are flying Chinese flags or Indian flags, basically all the ship owners are just going to stop flagging out
Panama.
That, and yeah, they're going to move either to Panama or to China or to wherever is the cheapest place for the tax point of view. So it doesn't work with shipping because shipping's mobile. Yeah, so all of these things are really complex issues. So obviously, if you're a smaller community like these small fishermen you can see here, you can self-regulate, you can come to agreements. If you're a large community, you've got to you've got to ban an activity, you've got to tax the activity so it becomes more expensive, or you've got to have some regulation by law. But you really need to, in a complex situation, you've got to be very careful, because there can be these unforeseen consequences. If you just try and say, yeah, one size fits all, Kyoto Agreement, we'll put that onto shipping, and then the result is that everybody just changes to the cheapest flag possible. So I've just got a little link there actually at the top. If you're interested in fish and fishing and all the rest of it, which obviously is a different faculty, but we work together on projects. The Marine Conservation Research site at the university's got some really exciting projects on their website.
Just on that topic, Dr. Tuck, I don't want to take over too much, sorry, but my background's in P&I insurance, and I started in fixed premium, and we had a small fleet of Taiwanese fishing vessels.
Yeah.
And this was the sort of business that is very commercially appealing, but from an insurer's point of view, but is very the regulation and all this sort of stuff. It was quite worrying. We had certain vessels and their management email us to say, what would be the premium for the fact that we are not manning these vessels to the safety standards and all this sort of stuff. So they were trying to price into their premiums the breaking of the law. Yeah. And that was just on the crewing. So the overfishing and all that sort of stuff. It was, yeah, I mean, as the documentation chap at age 18, it was a bit of a head scratcher, because you're sort of enabled, giving these ships their blue cards and they're off and, doing whatever else. So yeah, it's a real problem. But in the commercial world, there's someone somewhere that will enable it if they're getting their pockets lined. So yeah. How do you tackle that?
Well, basically, you have effective global regulation, and actually using insurance is one of the arms of regulation. So they're trying to make the insurance companies, to some extent, the regulators, by saying you don't insure a ship that is not actually complying with the letter of the law. And a lot of insurance companies won't. They will refuse, because they then could possibly become get some of the flack if there's a big issue or problem from it as well.
Just to clarify, we didn't insure we didn't insure the ship. It did go elsewhere. I think the point I was making is that they probably didn't struggle to find cover. They I mean, in the current framework, I'm sure they found it somewhere.
Oh yeah, absolutely, but not from one of the international group of P&I clubs. They would have found it probably from fixed payment cover somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and sorry that if you don't understand what we mean by P&I insurance, for everybody else, it's your third-party insurance on ships. So they insure ships against third-party risks, and it's done on a mutual basis. So it's mutual insurance, and there's this group of 13 big mutual P&I clubs that get together into the international group, and they are the most respected, and they cover most ships in the world. But yeah, it's a really good point. You've got to have regulation, because nothing else really works. Certainly being, self-sacrificing doesn't work, not in the business world. Everybody's after profits. So, and then you've got to have effective regulation. And how do you do that? So that's a whole area of research by itself. Okay, I just put that picture up because I really love that picture. But also, the comment there, going back to the fishing, that again at Plymouth, they've done research and they've been very much encouraging the use of marine protected zones. And what they've discovered is a marine protected zone is a zone where fishing's banned, completely banned. And obviously in that area, the fish can then regenerate and they can grow. And then they found what happens is that there's spillovers, because the fish then expand from that area into the areas where the fishermen can work, and it increases the catches for the fishermen, rather than, whereas the fishermen originally said, well, if you do that, we won't be able to catch enough to live. But you need research to show that that's what happens. Okay, so going on to the business of ships and logistics. I love ships. I love those pictures. So on the left, you have a BP tanker, the British Pioneer. And on the right-hand side, you have what looks like a handy size dry bulk ship going into New York. And these are the ships that are carrying out raw materials, our commodities and basic resources. And yeah, they pollute. So again, we have to have this global regulation to stop it. So in 2020, at the beginning of 2020, there was a change in the law that made it mandatory for ships to cut down on their emissions of sulfur dioxide because it was causing acid rain and lots of other health problems to people. So I actually, I've had a research student, a PhD researcher, who, on the basis of that, he researched what are the drivers of green innovation for ship equipment. And he was able to show from his research, demonstrate, you know, with evidence that bringing in this kind of regulation actually does make for innovation, which then helps us to get those technical solutions to our problems. So our most polluting ships are container ships and passenger ships, and they bring us our stuff. And our stuff, there we go, fills shops, and it's lovely to go shopping, but it is a problem because those ships do pollute, and particularly the ships that bring the boxes of containers. So should we buy less, restrain ourselves? Should maybe there be more taxes on the ships? If you know, the polluter pays, you tax pollution to make it less profitable. Or is there a technical fix? Can we design ships that burn less polluting fuel? So my comment there was actually to fix the problem, you really need to know what you're dealing with. So again, a new series of international regulations, both with the EU and the International Maritime Organization. They've just started measuring ships' CO2 emissions per work unit. That's a quantity of goods moved times the distance. And once we have that data, we can then start setting caps and saying, yeah, you've got to start bringing that down. But you've got to have the data first of all. So I'm actually
are you familiar at all, Dr. Tuck, with these? I think it's a very early technology, but I heard it mentioned in a podcast the other week about a form of scrubber that they hope will capture not only the sulfur but the CO2 from the emissions.
Yeah. So again, that carbon capture is one of the technological means that they're hoping to deal with the CO2 that we're emitting around the world. And yeah, like you, I just picked up on that there's research in carbon capture as well as the sulfur dioxide and other things. But again, you know, particulate matter, that's the little tiny particles, that's a big issue as well with ships' emissions, and that causes global warming too. Okay, so I'm actually running out of time here. So, but basically, you know, going back to the highways of the sea. So container ships follow our specific routes, and that's really captures that's in the Mediterranean, and you can just see how the ships, although they've got a completely open sea, there's no roads on the sea in terms of a physical road map, but they do go these predestined routes because it's the choke points and it's the you know, the islands and the straits that they're moving between. So we've got these big ones, the Suez Canal, Bosphorus, Dardanelles, Straits of Gibraltar. And I'm sure you've all been aware of the Suez Canal blockage. That was in March, the Ever Given, she got wedged. And I loved the memes around the little digger man. Yeah, but it was a big problem. You know, 12% of world trade goes through the Suez Canal. And the delays were costing, they reckon, about $400 million an hour in lost trade movements. So over 400 ships were trapped on either side by the blockage. And there's still disruptions today in the world supply chain. So I went shopping at the weekend, and I'm looking at the supermarket shelves, and I'm seeing gaps in the shelves. And I'm thinking, hang on a moment, you know, why is there still gaps? Why aren't we still getting our shelves filled up? Because we saw them in, you know, the height of the COVID worries, but why are they still there now? And that is because the world supply chains are still not working properly. And then things like the Suez Canal blockage is making it worse as well. So it just shows us how really, really dependent we are on what's being brought on those ships. And also the people that are providing the services that keep them going. So other key routes are English Channel, Straits of Malacca, which are the ones that are going through on the way to China, past Singapore, Panama Canal, the Strait of Hormuz, which is the exit from the Middle East Gulf, where all the oil tankers have to go, and then the straits, the Danish Straits into the Baltic Sea. So to do that, you need skilled navigators, and again, we need to research that. So to research that, at Plymouth, we use the simulator quite a lot for research. We've got this fabulous ship simulator there. And it's also used for training up the navigation cadets. But it's great. For example, a recent project was how you stop ships from hitting things like wave hubs and wind farms if you're putting them out in the middle of the oceans. So they used the navigator, the marine navigator, to research that. Okay, I think I am going beyond my time. So Alice, can I carry on, or yeah?
I think if everyone's happy to carry on, that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
But
great, yeah.
Avi, you okay? Do you want to use the chat? If you've got any questions, do use the chat. Okay, I'll go back. And so then, my theme, as I say, is highways of the ocean. And if you Google that, what you get is rubber ducks, because the rubber ducks, as they fall off, come out of containers that fall off container ships. They then float with beautiful ways of floating around the world, and Nike trainers do the same as well. And those have been used to plot the currents of the world. And you can see that so the highways of the ocean, the natural highways, are these ocean circulations, these currents. But the very earliest plotting of these currents was done by the early sailing ship explorers, and also gathering the data to make the charts. That came, in fact, from clipper ship captains who were asked by an American researcher to send in data and information about these currents and also the winds as well. And he produced the very earliest maps of that. So, that then brings us in with history and maritime history. You can study at Plymouth. And it brings us up to the modern date with our rubber ducks coming from our containers lost at sea. And that's a big problem of lost containers. Again, there's research needs to be done around that to see how we can stop containers from just, dropping their rubbish around the ocean. And then another issue is ship strikes. So that is a picture of a whale. Isn't that gorgeous? And it's not just whales though, but whales and other marine mammals. They actually get hit by ships. And there's been a few rather horrible cases of whales being caught up on the bows of a ship and being killed. So the best way to stop that is to keep the ships and the whales apart. But we need to know where the whales are to do that. And we also need to be able to control the ships and to have agreed routes on charts so that the ships are keeping away from the whales. So that leads to a partnership between the marine biologists and the maritime and logistics world. And so again, the animals themselves, the sea creatures and the birds as well, they use the ocean circulations and they use the warm upwellings of water, which provide plankton, and that then creates natural highways of the sea, which they've studied by putting tracking devices on the animals, which are relatively low cost today. And if you're studying marine biology, you know, there's major research projects around that. And I just put that picture in because I couldn't resist it. So that's sea lions dozing. And I think that really nicely illustrates that actually the natural world and the world of ships and shipping and logistics can coexist, because they'll haul themselves up onto buoys and onto jetties and just doze in the sunshine if the water's kept clean and clear, and they're left relatively undisturbed by being protected.
Dogs of the sea.
So then that leads me really to my conclusion. How do we continue to use the sea for global logistics in a sustainable way? And the only way to do it is we've got to have knowledge. We've got to do that research. We've got to gather the data. But we also need to think in a different way, because that idea of the, going back to the beginning, the tragedy of the commons, that was really popularized in the last century with some important papers that were published around overpopulation. And they were sort of saying, yeah, the tragedy of the commons is that men will keep producing children, especially if you've got a welfare state, and there's, they could be kept by the state, and therefore we're going to breed and breed and breed, and we're going to have too many people in the world, and we're going to trash the world that way. I read that paper again quite recently, and I thought, there's something missing from here, because his conclusion was, if there's nothing to stop men from producing more children, then they're going to overbreed, and the only way to stop it is regulation, is actually, bringing in laws so that, like in China, you only have one child. What was missing from that paper was one word, and that was woman or women. Because it's not men that have babies, it's women that have babies. And yeah, men can have, they can have 10, 20 children at absolutely no cost to them, especially if they're being kept by the welfare state. They tend to kill a few wives on the way, because I've seen that in family history research I've done myself in 19th century ancestors. They'll go through a couple of wives to produce their huge families. So if you start thinking, yeah, but what about the women? Women have a cost when they have children. So actually, instead of banning children and saying, oh, you can only have one child, if you empower women to take control of their bodies and their destinies, if you educate them, it turns out, you cut down the families. And in fact, there is a big problem in the Western world, in the educated world, of women not producing enough children for replacement levels. They've been empowered, but they weren't in that original paper. So to come to, to understand a problem, you need to think about it in different ways, not be trapped by your social way of thinking. And you also need to work across lots and lots of different disciplines. And by working in a cross-disciplinary way, by bringing in people from lots of different backgrounds, not just the sort of traditional backgrounds, by gathering the data and then making decisions on these complex, difficult areas with real knowledge and understanding, and with involving the people whose lives are being affected, that is really how we're going to be sustainable. So basically, yeah, at the University of Plymouth, what we're trying to do is, by advancing knowledge, transforming lives, and saving the planet, doing it all in a sustainable way. So, any questions, Felix or Avi?
No, I mean, I don't have anything specific from what we've spoken about. I found it all absolutely fascinating, and I think it was a great taster for September, and why I've sort of decided to go to university and sort of leave P&I. So I think I want to go and study all of these topics and get a better understanding of them, and I'm just really looking forward to it. So thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for joining us. And Avi, thank you also for joining us as well. Hope you've enjoyed it.